Hi everyone and welcome. Today we're joined by Dr. Daniel Ganser, an academic and best-selling author, to discuss US foreign policy and NATO as an instrument of its foreign policy. Thank you so much for coming on. It's a great privilege to have you as a guest.
Thank you, Glenn, for inviting me.
What is interesting though about NATO and its covert operations, then especially Operation Gladio, is that the information is publicly available, yet it's not a very popular issue to discuss, and it's one of these things, I guess, which would be more comfortable if we just bear it in history. But I do think it's important because it has an enduring relevance. Because after the Cold War, we initially had an agreement to develop an inclusive European security architecture, more or less modeled around the Helsinki Accords or Gorbachev's Common European Home. So security was supposed to be based on individual security. Indivisible security. We would manage security competition. In other words, indivisible security, meaning one side should not enhance its security at the expense of others.
Yeah.
So addressing competing security concerns, a very Westphalian approach, if you will. But instead, we decided to expand NATO. The argument is that it's an inter-democratic security institution, suggesting it's more benign. We elevate the role of liberal democracy in international security, something everyone would benefit from. So the argument was that this is not merely about hegemony, or a return to Cold War bloc politics. We would all benefit. This is the argument. But I think this is why it's important to have a honest, therefore, discussion about NATO's past. Operation Gladio is obviously a very important case study. So I was wondering if you can, I guess, outline what Gladio was and how it operated within NATO.
Yeah, thank you very much. Gladio is the word for a sword, a short Roman sword. So some people maybe know the gladiators, and there's even a film Gladiator, when in ancient Rome, some 2,000 years ago, they were fighting and they were using these short double-edged swords. So the word Operation Gladio actually is being used in Italy or was used in Italy to describe a secret stay-behind army that operated during the Cold War. And stay behind is a term from military history, and it means that if a country is being invaded and the normal regular army is being defeated, a secret stay behind army would sort of become active in the back of the enemy. And the idea was in the Cold War, which we can say roughly lasted from 45 to 1990. In this Cold War, these stay-behind armies were set up by the CIA and the MI6, so the British and the American Secret Service. And this is confirmed. Like, this is not, some people go like, oh, that's all conspiracy theory. No, this was confirmed by the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, so the SOCR, which is always an American general. And in Italy, this was discovered in 1990 by Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti. So he said, we have this secret army here in Italy. It was set up by the CIA. It was set up by MI6. And it was coordinated by NATO. And NATO had two secret establishments, which we were called the Allied Clandestine Committee and the Clandestine Planning Committee. And in these committees, representatives from all NATO states met to discuss the stay-behind matter. So Gladio is the code name for the stay-behind in Italy, but there were also stay-behind armies in France, in Spain, in Portugal, in Germany, in Norway, in Sweden, in Finland, in Denmark, in Luxembourg, in Belgium, and also in neutral Switzerland. So in all countries in Western Europe. Obviously, at the time, as you know, but just to remind your listeners, Europe was divided. And so there were then NATO countries, and on the other side, we had the Warsaw Pact. But I realized, I researched this in my book, NATO Secret Armies, and the stay-behind armies in other countries had different names. So in Switzerland, for instance, the stay-behind army was called P26, and in Belgium, it was called SDRA8. So, there's really different names. but Operation Gladio was the name in Italy, and it was discovered in 1990.
Yeah, it was, as you said, also recognized back in 1990, largely because of, yeah, the Italians. But the European Parliament, or the predecessor of it in 1990, it demanded that the CIA and NATO would stop terrorism within Western Europe. I mean, I have a quote in which it said, yeah, whereas over 40 years, this organization has eluded all democratic controls and has been run by secret services of the states concerned in collaboration with NATO. Whereas in certain member states, military secret services or controlled branches thereof were involved in serious cases of terrorism and crime, as evidenced by various judicial inquiries. Now, it is a quite, yeah, extraordinary, and again, that we went from having to clean up this past until, yeah, organizing all of European security around this. It is quite extraordinary. But how has any NATO officials or state leaders then been held accountable for these crimes, which were committed through the decades?
No, no, unfortunately, there's never been anybody held accountable, and there was never an official apology for these crimes. Because, Glenn, keep in mind, the stay behind armies were set up by the CIA and the MI6 together with the local secret services. So in Turkey, you had the local secret service, MIT, working with them. In Italy, it was the SIFAR, Servizio Informazione Forze Armate. In Germany, you had the BND, Bundesnachrichtendienst. And so in each country, you had the respective secret service involved. In France, it was the Direction Générale pour la Sécurité Extérieure, DGSE. And when I went to do my PhD, it was, I had 4 years to investigate Gladio. I researched part of it at the LSE in London. And I asked my professors, I mean, these were professors in international history, and not just some professor. LSE is regarded as a very good university. And, had only very sketchy knowledge. That was in 99, so 9 years after the networks had been discovered. And so there was some data publicly available, and the data which was available confirmed very clearly that these stay-behind armies existed. So the first thing that I did, I collected the data on each and every country. For instance, Belgium, the defense minister of Belgium at the time was in Italy, and he spoke to the Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, and he said, this is scary stuff. I mean, why don't you have a secret? Why do you have a secret army in your country? Everything should be controlled by parliament, and you should not have a secret army. And then Giulio Andreotti said to the Belgian defense minister, well, you also have a secret army in your country. And the Belgian defense minister said, how is this possible? I'm the defense minister. I should know about it. And then Andreotti told him, just fly back to Brussels and ask your chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he did that, and he flew back to Brussels. And in Belgium, as defense minister, he asked his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the highest ranking military. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff then confirmed that there exists a secret army in Belgium. And then he said, well, Jesus Christ, I'm the defense minister. I should know about it. Why don't I know about it? And then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, well, you're just a politician. You politicians, you come and go. You form coalition governments depending on how many people are in parliament and whatever. But we are military people. We're here for eternity. And the same thing is something that I realized in Switzerland. The Swiss defense minister at the time was called Caspar Filigo. And the director of the Swiss secret army, P26, was Ephraim Catalan. And so Ephraim Catalan said, "Oh yeah, gee, we didn't inform Filigo. We just didn't. He was not in office for so long." So there's a whole series of problems that we look at. First of all, we look at the problem of democratic control. If the defense minister doesn't know, or in some countries knows, and in other countries doesn't know, like I know that in Belgium and in Switzerland, the defense minister didn't know, then that is against all democratic principles. And then secondly, Glenn, Parliament should know. If there's a secret army, Parliament should know. But in Switzerland, for instance, and also in Italy, parliamentarians were not informed. Also in Norway or in France, they were not informed that a secret army existed within their country, equipped and financed and trained by the CIA and MI6. So that's a second problem. I looked at the case of Switzerland, how they organize the funding, because obviously Parliament has always to decide on the funding, and so they bought a communications equipment, harpoon equipment, it was called at the time, for the different stay-behind armies. Always the same communication equipment for Italy and for Germany, for Switzerland and France. But they had to bury these costs in infrastructure, huge infrastructure projects for the defense ministry. So they had to cover the costs within the parliamentary system. So you had somebody from the finance department also involved to cover up the traces. And okay, that's already very problematic. And the person from the European Parliament that you just quoted said correctly, we cannot have security in Europe if we don't even know about these secret armies, because then we come to the most critical and most delicate third step. These secret armies were equipped with weapons and with explosives and with communication equipment. And the idea was that in case of a Soviet invasion, they would work as a guerrilla network, that they could, blow up bridges or blow up arms caches or help NATO pilots that were shot down to escape to the sea and then, to a submarine and back to their country. And so obviously these secret stay-behind armies had explosives. Now, these explosives were hidden across the country, so many different places. In Italy, sometimes they were hidden in cemeteries, or in Switzerland, they were hidden in the Alps, in the mountains, in caches, and in Norway, they were hidden in different places, and in Belgium. And so these arms caches, then, people started looking for them, and they were found. Okay, the evidence was there; they were found. And the NATO narrative was, oh, we don't comment on secret operations. That was the NATO narrative. But behind closed doors, the NATO ambassadors were meeting. And then the Italian NATO ambassador, whose name is Ambassador Fulci, he said that in some cases, these NATO arms Gladio caches with the explosives were used to carry out terrorist attacks in Italy. And Glenn, that's the moment when we move to a completely different level. Then we're talking about NATO terrorism in NATO countries, or CIA terrorism, or MI6 terrorism in NATO countries. And when I started to work on this level, like the other levels are, let's say, easy. Okay, they had these secret armies. Okay, they had the arms. Okay, they had the weapons, and it was all covered, and parliaments didn't know, and university professors didn't know, and journalists didn't know. But once that became known, that the structure was there, you can really confirm from different countries, also in Turkey and in Greece, okay, the structure is there, and there's no doubt about it. William Colby, former CIA director, wrote about it. The structure is there. But then I went this step further, and based on the Italian data said they carried out terrorist attacks. For instance, 1969 in Milano, in Italy, that's a big city in northern Italy, and they blamed these terrorist attacks on the political left, on the Italian Communist Party, in order to weaken the Italian Communist Party at the poll, because they didn't want that the Italian Communist Party becomes very influential. And then, for instance, you have a communist defense minister in Italy, because they said, okay, this defense minister would, betray all secrets of NATO to Moscow. He would basically call Moscow and tell them everything. So you had about 30% of the Italian parliament was controlled by the communists. But in order to weaken them, they had arms caches, and these arms caches were then used by right-wing organizations like Ordine Nuovo, and they carried out terrorist attacks. So I stand by my finding that there was NATO terrorism in Western Europe. But as you rightly say, this is an extremely sensitive topic.
Yeah, so one can see the logic though of establishing secret armies, putting the weapons behind in case there's a a military invasion,
Yeah.
and so it can be fought. But I guess the predictable consequences if you have secret armies with armed to the teeth, and they have they can operate in the shadow. There's gonna be a lot of opportunities to abuse this. And as you say,
Yeah.
you can then begin to target your political opposition. You can have terrorist attacks, blame it on the other guy. And and this is obviously very problematic. But so I guess two questions. What kind of crimes were otherwise committed? What kind of missions did they have? And this is again not used for fighting, the Soviets after we've been invaded. This is, finding other uses for this secret army. And I guess the
Mhm.
second is how does this affect democracy and, to have people at the top levels not being aware of this until they actually start to look.
Yeah. Well, the list of terrorist attacks carried out with the involvement of NATO, CIA, MI6, Gladio, is not complete. That has to be said. The list of terrorist attacks is not complete. So I always suggest, if anybody is interested, to start with Italy. Italy wasn't the only country that was hit by terrorist attacks. We obviously had terrorist attacks in France during the time when Algeria was seeking its independence, and part of the French military, Organisation Armée Secrète, was against it. So there were the problems within the French movement that part of the military was actually against letting Algeria go into an independent country. So there were terrorist attacks there, and it seems that stay-behind people were involved. In other countries, Switzerland, I'm Swiss citizen, and I'm here in Switzerland speaking to you. But in Switzerland, we didn't have terrorist attacks. But the thing with my biography is that I was born in Lugano, and that is the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. So I speak Italian, and so my interest was very strongly drawn to Italy. And in Italy, the situation is such that during the Second World War, Mussolini was running the country, so a fascist like Hitler. And there was a strong resistance movement against Mussolini. And the Americans cooperated with this Italian resistance movement, the partisans. This was the OSS, Office of Strategic Services of Donovan, who was, the predecessor of the CIA. And they supplied the resistance with weapons. And so these, left-leaning groups were being supporting during Second World War. And then when the Second World War ended, the Americans said, "Oh, we don't want to support the socialists and the communists anymore in Italy. It's time to stop sending them any arms." And if you look at the data, you see that the partisans, partigiani, as they're called in Italy, were very sad because from one day to the other, the OSS didn't give them any weapons anymore. And then in 1948, the Italians had their first free, or not actually free, but their first national elections. And the CIA had been created in 1947. And so the CIA was given the task by President Truman to manipulate these elections in Italy so the socialists and the communists would not win these elections because, they had a lot of public support because they had, opposed Mussolini. And by the time in 48, Mussolini was obviously dead and the left was hoping for a big victory. But the Americans wanted to integrate Italy into NATO in 49. So the CIA, the first job of the CIA was not, to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran or Arbenz in Guatemala, but it was actually to manipulate the Italian elections in 1948. And they did that with a smear campaign. So, all the left-leaning politicians were attacked as being bad people. And then they created Democrazia Cristiana Italiana, which is a new party, and they used the word democrazia, which sounds like democracy is nice, and Cristiana, because Italy is a Catholic country, so they thought, let's bring the Christian thing in, so that's going to attract people, and Italy. So democracy, Catholic Church, and Italy, and they framed a party out of this and pumped million into it. And in fact, the DCI then won the Italian elections. And so the problem was that every year, every 4 years, you had elections again. And then In 1969, for instance, you had these terrorist attacks and in Milano. This is one where I'm absolutely sure that the arms were used from the Gladio arms caches, because it's very delicate to research this. On the one hand, you have the secret armies with the arms caches and the CIA trainers and the Italian military secret service people involved, some of whom wrote books about it, you know. For instance, General Inzerilli, he wrote the book and said, yes, yes, I was a commander of Gladio. But they always say, no, we didn't carry out the terrorist attacks, you know. Also, the CIA says, yeah, yeah, we had the secret armies. Oh, yes, of course, we had explosives. And, you know, the French officers would tell you the same. In every country, you had the officers and people in the know who tell you, yeah, sure, we were preparing for the Soviet invasion. But nobody of them says, and we blew up women and children. You know, this is against all military ethics in every country. You can't say that and be proud of it. And so if you go to 1969 and Milano, there you can actually show that Ordine Nuovo, which is a right-wing paramilitary group in Italy, received the weapons from an Gladio arms cache. Because as you rightly say, these arms caches and the explosives were there, and they should never have been used because there was no Soviet invasion. But then, as you say, it's true that if you're in a political struggle and you have opponents, and at one point you say, okay, why don't we use the explosive that we have, not against the Soviet invasion, but against a political opponent, and we just carry out a terrorist attack using some right-wing extremists. And then we blame it on the communists, and then the communists look bad, and that's the idea. It's if I may explain it that way, it's like what happened in Ukraine in 2014 in Kiev. You had this snipers who were in the hotel Ukraine and then on the conservatory, and they shot both demonstrators and police forces from the Berkut unit. And as Katchanovsky has shown, this was a false flag terrorist attack. You shoot people like 100 or 50, you just have dead bodies. And then this was blamed on Yanukovych, who was then, the elected president of Ukraine. And Yanukovych had to flee. You can create a lot of political pressure on other political parties if you carry out terrorism and blame them for it. And that this is what happened in Italy. So I would really go with Piazza Fontana is one example. You ask for different examples. So Peteano in 1972, they had a small car, Fiat 500, Cinquecento as they call it. 500 is in Italian is Cinquecento. And so they had this little car parked at the side of the road. And Peteano is just a small village in the north of Italy. And then they had the call to the police forces and said, an anonymous person calls the police, the Carabinieri, and says, check out this car. We don't know. It's, there on the side of the street where nobody should park, and it's been there for a few days. Why don't you check it out? So the police goes there and opens, the hood of the car, and that triggers the bomb, and 3 policemen get killed. So this is an attack on the state, if you kill police officers. And, there was a funeral and everything, and of course, a lot of press coverage. And then you have a call, again, an anonymous call, and it says, we did this, and we are the Brigate Rosse left-wing extremists. So the whole story is framed as an attack of the left-wing extremists in order to weaken the political parties on the left, because people would then think, I'm not going to vote socialists, or I'm not going to vote communists because, these people are crazy. They carry out terrorist attacks, maybe not they themselves, but people close to them. And only many years later, you had a member of Ordine Nuovo. His name is Vincenzo Vinciguerra. And he said, I carried out the terrorist attack in Peteano. And after the attack, I was protected by the Italian Secret Service. They flew me to Spain because Spain at the time was a dictatorship under Franco, right-wing dictatorship. So they made sure, that I was safe. And they wanted all terrorism to come from the political left. And you even had the assassination of Aldo Moro, who was the prime minister of Italy, who said he wants to bring in communists into into the government. And so it's really it's a dark road, you know, it's a dark road that you travel down if you look at Operation Gladio.
When you spoke of Italy, it did remind me a bit about Greece as well, because there, the left goes from
Yeah.
allied to then being purged after the war. But also similar with the Ukrainians though, because during the war, of course, there were yeah, we were fighting fascists, but then once the fascists were defeated, we saw that American intelligence agencies began to work with the fascists in Ukraine, all the way through the 50s as an opponent to yeah, to the Soviet Union. Even in 1941, you had Harry Truman, before he became president, who argued that what American policy should be during the war, which was, if the Germans are winning, we should help Russia. If Russia is winning, we should help the Germans. And this
Yeah.
way, we can let as many of them, we can let them kill as many of each other as possible. That this is the goal. But then also it implies once one side starts to lose, then you have to switch to against
Yeah.
support that guy. So that flexibility is quite yeah. There's a long history of it, but beyond winning other people's election, as you argued in Italy, of putting together political parties, doing the financing, and yeah, winning their election. This is something not just from 2014, but we saw in Ukraine in 2004 as well. But what is interesting is towards the 80s, the US seemed to take it one step further, which is not just win election, but why do countries get to have their own civil society? Why shouldn't this be represented by the United States? So this development of NGOs or non-governmental organizations financed by the US and staffed often with people from the intelligence community simply to hijack the civil society of other countries. I mean, this is also something you've seen not just in the former East Bloc countries, but now, well, during the Cold War, but now afterwards as well. In Georgia, 2003, Ukraine, 2004, Ukraine again in 2014. Uh, but yeah, why is there not more academic interest in this? Because the evidence is all there. If you look at
Yeah.
what you're talking about, or the NGOs, all the information is there. Where the finance is coming from, who the people are. It's a bit strange to me that there's so little academic interest.
Well, I think that Europeans are scared to say that there's CIA terrorism in Europe. You know, it's like if you say the CIA now with the US bombing Iran, some people say the CIA and the MI6 overthrew the government of Iran, the government of Mossadegh in 1953, which was clearly a breach of international law. It was a violation of the UN Charter. Because obviously the UN Charter says that all states of the United Nations should, avoid the use and threat of force in international relation. So, that's actually forbidden to overthrow a government in a different country. And I think Europeans are aware of that. You know, they say, okay, yeah, we've seen the CIA overthrowing the government in Iran in '53. Or Europeans are also aware of it and say, okay, we've seen the Americans overthrowing the government in Guatemala, for instance, in 1954. Or we've seen the CIA involved in killing Lumumba in the Congo in 1961. Or we've seen the US bombing Vietnam. We've seen that they use Agent Orange, and we've seen, that they also bomb Laos and Cambodia. And yeah, we've seen them bombing Afghanistan. We've seen them bombing Sudan and obviously Iran-Contra. We've seen them supplying the Contras to defeat the Sandinistas in the 80s in Nicaragua. And we've seen them, overthrowing the government in Chile of Salvador Allende in '73. So, it's not that Europeans are naive about the topic of US imperialism, but they have this very strange idea that they would never do that to Europe, because it's like we see the tactics, we see the brutality of it, but we're sure they wouldn't do it to us. And Glenn, if I may take one example, when Seymour Hersh said that the terrorist attack on the Nord Stream pipeline was an act of U.S. state terrorism against Germany, you would obviously, that was in 22. You would expect that many German newspapers or many German university professors pick up the story and say, yeah, that is terrorism of one NATO country against another NATO country. So within the 32 NATO countries, you actually have examples where the US uses terrorism against infrastructure. In this case, nobody was killed, but still a very heavy blow to the German economy, who's now suffering under high energy prices, and people are losing money and companies are going bankrupt. But as you rightly say, this is not being discussed. This is not, it's like a taboo zone. You cannot discuss CIA terrorism against Germany because there is no CIA terrorism. It's already, the assumption is the CIA wouldn't do that. And then the only solution is, oh, the Pentagon wouldn't do that, special forces. It's not always the CIA, the special forces involved also in Gladio. Um, um, and the assumption is always Joe Biden, then president when the Nord Stream was blown up, wouldn't do that. They wouldn't do that. And that's the same problem that I had with my research. In 69, Nixon was president in the United States. And, he was bombing Vietnam and he was bombing Laos, he was bombing Cambodia. So everybody saw that Nixon was killing thousands of people. But in Italy, they were thinking, no, he wouldn't kill people in Italy, right? He wouldn't do that. And it took a few years until Giandelia Maletti came forward. His ranking was general, so high-ranking military officer, and he was working in the Italian Defense Intelligence Service. So the Defense Intelligence Service actually has to watch whether other countries are infiltrating Italy and whether they are carrying out terrorist attacks. I mean, that's what defense, has to do. They have to find out whether other countries are wreaking havoc in your country. And he said, the terrorist attack in Milano was influenced by people in America. And he used this very cautious wording. He said, Nixon was a very strange man, and he was, using unorthodox methods. And that's a leading member of the Italian intelligence community in the rank of a general who says this. And he said this at a trial where they were trying to find out who's responsible for all this terrorism. Because on the lowest level, you obviously have the people who carry it out. Nixon is not going to take the ship, go to Italy, plant the bomb. But on the lowest level, you have people from Ordine Nuovo, and they're just fascists, right-wing extremists who think, within the Cold War context, that communists are evil. They're not always only in the Soviet Union; they're also in Italy in the Communist Party. So it's correct to fight them. I always try to find out the mentality of these people, and they say the Cold War was a hot war, so it's okay to kill. So you can identify them, and that has been done. On a higher level, then you have NATO structures, CIA structures, MI6 structures, because CIA and MI6 were offering military equipment that, explosives, hand grenades, machine guns, ammunition, communication equipment. So that was coming from the CIA and the MI6, and also MI6 and CIA with the special forces, the Green Berets or the Special Air Services, SAS from the British, were giving the training. The British and the American hand is clearly there. And then in some countries, like in Turkey in 1981, they overthrew the government. In Italy, we have terrorist attacks, but in Turkey, they overthrew the government, and stay-behind forces were involved. And CIA, the office chief then, Heinz Henze, said was pride, to say, okay, we overthrew the government in Turkey. And in Greece as well, in 1967, when the government was overthrown, the stay-behind armies were involved. So if you look at the stay-behind network in total, I presented my findings in 2001. In September 2001, just 2 weeks before the terrorist attacks of 9/11, I said, terrorism can be used to manipulate the political climate. And ever since, there have been people here and there interested in it and say, gee, that's crazy stuff. I mean, why would NATO carry out terrorist attacks and CIA? And if they do, why would the countries, uh, who were targeted, why would they not suddenly and immediately leave NATO and say this is a dangerous club? I don't want to be member of it. And why is there not even a debate? And then I say, well, it's very much like Ukraine. It's very hard in Ukraine to speak about the false flag terrorism of February 2014. Some people speak about it. And it's very much like the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline and the talking about it in Germany. Some people speak about it. Seymour Hersh, excellent man, spoke about it. Or with Ukraine, Jeffrey Sachs speaks about it. Katchanovsky speaks about it. You speak about it. So, some people speak about it, but it's a very small research community, really, who looks at false flag terrorism.
Yeah, I think it lies in a bit in human nature. If you do feel, if you have the power to organize who we are and them, us and them, because this is a key instinct in humanity, then you can um, yeah, get away with this because human beings will always to keep the group intact. You will make excuses
Yeah.
for your own. You exaggerate how much we have in common with allies, and you exaggerate how different we are from opponents. And this way, you make sure that yeah, in group solidarity does not is not threatened by reality and facts, I guess. But
Yeah,
yeah, with
exactly.
but it's interesting though. This I always thought that to this extent, Bush was better than Obama and Trump was better than Biden, to the extent that it's possible at least to criticize the United States. The worst is if there's a leader like Obama, which the Europeans are just falling over, to kiss his feet. Then it's really impossible they can do anything they want. But the Nord Stream was a fascinating event because even now that it's come out that it wasn't the Russians after all. It was they try to blame the Ukrainians only, even though I have a hard time believing that the Americans did not greenlight or did this directly. But instead, the argument is, we knew that it was not Russia. We knew it, or we knew about the attack before it actually happened. This is what we hear now. But then I'm curious, where the journalist who should ask a key question? Well, what happened after the attack? Because all our political leaders, all our media were pointing the finger, saying, "Well, this is Putin's playbook. All traces are leading to Russia," and we used this lie to militarize the Baltic Sea, which we're still doing, by the way. We used it also to escalate the war in Ukraine. So, if the Americans knew that it wasn't the Russians behind this, how can you explain to the public that they staged a terrorist attack against Europe, destroyed our critical energy infrastructure, and then used this lie in order to militarize the Baltic Sea and escalate the war against Ukraine, which is now obviously destroying Ukraine and is destroying the European economies as well. So it's just if you want to justify it, okay, go ahead and justify it, but no interest at all, no journalist at all thinks that this is newsworthy. It's kind of astonishing the group discipline that has been instilled on the Europeans. I mean, it's who how can you actually how can you pull this off? It's quite amazing.
I think, Glenn, that the Europeans are now becoming aware that every war is being fought in the air, in the sea, on the land, and the fourth dimension, very important, is information warfare. And what you've just described is for me that some people realize that they have been subject of information warfare. For every beginner, I always say, start with Nord Stream. That's the easiest. There's nobody killed, so it's not so emotional. But still, it's heavy damage because people lose their jobs, people lose money. It's significant. You cannot say it doesn't matter. It's really significant. But start with Nord Stream. So now you see it was blown up, and then you have a first really honest person coming forward who researches it, who's Seymour Hersh. And then check his story. He basically says the U.S. administration did it. And Seymour Hersh, to my mind, is a very credible person. He also said, Trump is going to bomb Iran like he said it the day or 2 days before Trump actually did it. And Seymour Hersh has excellent contacts into the CIA, into the Pentagon, and into other secret services in the United States who disagree, who disagree with what the U.S. imperial power does. And the people that talk to Seymour Hersh don't want that Nord Stream is blown up. They don't want that Trump bombs Iran, as he now just did. So you have dissenting voices, whistleblowers, if you want to call them whistleblowers, but not with their name in public. So I say let's start with Nord Stream, and then look how European press groups covered this, or how European state leaders covered this, and it's incredible. It was this discussion about U.S. terrorism never really made the headlines. It was it was not terrorism. It was not U.S. terrorism. It was just a sabotage operation. So the wording and the framing and the narrative. So wording is just one word, framing is two or three words, and the narrative is one paragraph. The wording was, it's not terrorism, it's sabotage. And then the framing was, it was Russian sabotage, Russian sabotage. Like, okay, the Russians are destroying their own pipelines. Only the most foolish people would go along with this. And then, oh no, it's Ukrainians. That was the narrative. Zelensky was aware of it, but he couldn't stop the operation.
Did his
Absolutely.
best.
Like, on a bad day, he had low battery on his cell phone or whatever the story. It's just all nonsense. And it's if once you've gone through Nord Stream and you realize that Seymour Hersh has the best credibility of all people who cover it, and then probably you come to the conclusion that it's U.S. terrorism, then you can go one step further and say, okay, then we have to realize there's U.S. terrorism in Europe, and that it really has to sink in. For some people, it's like it's impossible. And I say, okay, go slowly. You don't have to start with Italy and the Cold War. Take Nord Stream. And then the second step, if just to give somebody maybe advice on how to enter the area of secret warfare, the second step really, I think, is Ukraine in 2014. I say the Russian invasion in 22 on February 24 in 2022 was illegal. It was a violation of the UN Charter. But before that, in February 2014, we had a coup d'etat. I know there's a debate who carried out the coup d'etat, but it was for 100% a coup d'etat. Because I have some friends, I don't know how the debate in Norway is, but here in Switzerland, some friends come to me and say, hey, Daniele, I understand that the government was overthrown, but it was just the people in the streets, they were shouting and tell the government, to leave. And then suddenly that government left because they were corrupt. And I say, no, you didn't pay attention. It wasn't like that. The people were shouting, they were in the streets. But on one specific day, on February 20, 2014, you had people on the roofs, and they were shooting both demonstrators and the police. So you have two groups in clashes for many days, and then you have a third party on the roofs, and we know on which roofs. It was in Hotel Ukraine on the conservatory. So that's thanks to Kotkanovsky, who did an excellent research. And they shot from there, both groups. And then they blamed it on the president. Then I say, look at it. This is very clearly strategy of tension. And the tension is not with the people who are dead. They have no tension anymore. The tension is with the people who observe this. And you create tension like fear and hatred. That's emotional tension. And then you blame it on President Yanukovych. And so Yanukovych fled, and a coup government took part. I mean, Zelensky in the end is in a succession of people who, the first, not Zelensky, who was voted in 2019, but Poroshenko and people in between who started the civil war. They came to power through false flag strategy of tension. And we in NATO, we just don't want to talk about it. We don't want to talk about Nord Stream. We don't want to talk about the coup d'etat in 2014. And now we come to Gladio. This is even further down, because this is the Cold War, and for most people, Italy is just where you go for your summer vacation, and you buy your kids an ice cream. That's basically Italy, and when you or maybe Ferrari or maybe Italian food. But when you tell them that there were terrorist attacks in Italy by Gladio, by Operation Gladio, people go crazy. Like I've met a lot of people who tell me this can't be, Daniele. I just don't believe it. I love Italy, and you can't tell me that, and it really disturbs me, and it's upsetting, and I don't want to hear it. And then I go further and say, if you go to Germany, you will realize that at the end of the Second World War, a lot of Nazis were put on before trial, the so-called Nürnberger trial, Nuremberg. But not all, and that's important. For instance, one guy, Reinhard Gehlen, he was made the boss of the German Secret Service, Bundesnachrichtendienst, which before was called Operation Gehlen. And Operation Gehlen had the networks of right-wing extremists. And these right-wing extremists, you know, Nazis until 1945, these guys were very anti-communist. You know, they hated the Soviets. So the CIA said, that's the good guys. We need them. You know, we need somebody with a very strong anti-communist position, ideology, and they put them in the stay behind networks. And when the stay behind networks were uncovered in Germany in 1990, that was the time when Chancellor Kohl was in power. It was very embarrassing for them because it was there's a secret Nazi army in your country, and they have explosions, explosives, and they have ammunition, and we should look into this. And everybody was like, oh, let's not talk about it.
Yeah, he was Hitler's chief of the Wehrmacht military intelligence. That is Reinhard
Ja,
Gehlen, and
fremde
uh,
Herren Ost.
yeah, and again, he was Christopher Hitchens. He once made the point that the marriage between the fascists and the CIA was, it infused something very ugly into America, which he argued that there has to be more openness about this and speaking about it in order to start to deal with some of the consequences. As you said, what happened since those days and where we are now. There's a bit of a common thread going on. Again, Galen, is hired by the CIA to run American intelligence in Europe. I mean, the Hitler's
That's
guy.
right.
This is, and again, it's not a
And most
conspiracy
people don't
theory.
know it.
No,
Glenn,
but
most
this
people
is
don't know it.
established. Why is this not problematic? No, but the idea that NATO was just about liberal democracy and freedom, but if you want to address why people don't want to deal with this, I think it's Walter Lippmann. He once wrote that if you strike the core of people's key convictions or beliefs, how they organize the worldview. So, we are liberal democracies, we're good, freedom. Our opponents, they're always bad. They don't like
Yep.
freedom, they're against democracy, they're imperialists. Now, if you view the world through this lens, he argued that even if any information that contradicts this fundamental worldview, that people will reject it on their own. You don't always, I don't, sorry, you don't always need a big state, a government operation to censor it. People in their natural instinct to preserve their fundamental assumption about the world and their group loyalty will just choose to look the other way and ignore it. So it's no, but it's quite problematic. But
Yeah, it's like the shadow, it's the shadow of yourself or the shadow in your own group. I think there's even a film that I've seen many, many years ago. It's called Festen, and I think it's been produced in the Scandinavian countries. I don't know if you know the film, but it basically is about one guy who talks about the abuse within the family that happened, and he wants to bring some truth into the whole thing, and they just bring him out. They don't want to hear him, and it's right what you say is we're talking here about psychology. It's like, how can it be that in our own group, the secret services are carrying out terrorism, and in Europe it's Gladio. And in the US, for instance, it's the assassination of Kennedy in 1963. I'm in my other book on the US. Have written that I'm totally convinced that the story with Lee Harvey Oswald is just a bogus story. It's not true. This is still what you read on Wikipedia that Lee Harvey Oswald killed John F. Kennedy in 1963 in Dallas, and he's just a lonely, crazy guy. That's it. That's the level of Wikipedia that you get. But people who go deeper, see it as a coup d'état in the United States by the CIA. The CIA had people who killed Kennedy. But now people listening to us or listening to this conversation might think, no, no, this guy is going a bit too far. I mean, if the CIA killed Kennedy, then why was the CIA not closed down? I mean, how can this be? And then we talk about the deep state and we talk about covert action operations. And I think we are now in a process where people realize that covert action operation exists, but they have existed for many years. I mean, when the CIA was created in 1947, there was always a department which was doing analysis. Like Ray McGovern, for instance, is an excellent guy, isn't he? He's a former CIA, and they do analysis. So they are very much like university professors. They speak many languages, they travel the world, they read a lot, and they're interested in many topics. But then there's also the paramilitary guys who carry out covert operations. And these guys, they have never been there was no scrutiny of what the CIA did. There was the church investigation in the mid 1970s, but ever since there was nothing. And so it's very hard for researchers to discuss Operation Gladio. But now, thanks to YouTube, I think it's now 20 years that we have YouTube. It was created in 2005. It's now 25, so 20 years of YouTube. We can have these open debates. And I want to thank you, Glenn. I watch your YouTube channel a lot, and I really think you help people to understand international politics. I am very grateful for that.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. But on Ray McGovern, though, on the topic of sabotage, he was 27 years in the CIA. He was chairing the National Intelligence Estimate. He was giving the daily intelligence briefs to President Reagan. I mean, he was the central guy. He also now was warning that according to past history, we should be very worried that there will be like a false flag attacks against some American ships or something to So it's not as if this belongs to the dark corners of the internet. This is established practice over time. It's just strange to me that it's almost dismissed as if it will be like a conspiracy theory. I mean, when you see people criticizing the war, for example, against Afghanistan, people say, oh, well, why shouldn't America just want to help young girls go to school, or yeah, why it's wrong to bomb Iran? This is going to be a disaster. Or yeah, but they don't have proper democracy. We need more women's right. I mean, how do we get to this position where we believe that the United States, with a long history, very brutal history, and a security strategy based on global primacy and hegemony. Somehow, we repeat the idea that yes, now of course they occupy Afghanistan for 20 years so girls can go to school. Yeah, of course they're bombing Iranian reactors, pushing for regime change because they don't like that the women don't have more rights, that they should you know it's astonishing to me that this is the narratives everyone is running with. It's same as with Ukraine. You can tell people, well, when we toppled the government there, only 20% wanted NATO. So why do we keep saying that, we're fighting so they can choose their own foreign policies? There's nothing there. I always get the same feedback. Well, why are you saying this? Is it, it sounds like it's controversial because, or they say, well, this is a pro-Kremlin talking point because this is what the Russians would say. And I don't really care at all what the Russians might say. You have objective reality and then you have what is fake. And it looks as if the main strategy now is just to defend the narrative against all inconvenient facts, even if those narratives end up hurting ourselves. I mean, what are we doing like in Ukraine? This war was unnecessary. We're not winning, destroying the Ukrainians. We're destroying the European economies. At the time, America's planning to leave. I mean, there's no strategic benefit. There's no humanitarian benefit. But still, we're locked into these narratives which can't be contested unless you want to be, smeared as an agent of Putin. It's just yeah, it's very dangerous. This that there's no talk around these crazy narratives.
It is true that you point the finger to the word narrative, because a narrative basically is just a group of thoughts in your head. That's all it is. And what I've realized when I research Operation Gladio, that it has a lot to do with the control of the narrative. The story how the book was written is so that I worked on the Cuban Missile Crisis before, and I thought it's just very fascinating. The CIA trying to overthrow Fidel Castro in 1961 in the Bay of Pigs invasion, and then with the Soviets bringing missiles into Cuba, and then Kennedy putting up a blockade and telling the Soviets to leave and stuff. So I read books by Noam Chomsky and Bill Bloom, two American authors, and I thought these books were very interesting. So I sent them my analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then they say, "Oh, that's very interesting." And then I flew over to the U.S. and met Noam Chomsky at the MIT, and I met Bill Bloom in Washington. And we exchanged thoughts about U.S. imperialism. And Noam basically said, Daniele, this is called manufacturing consent. And I said, oh yeah, I read your book about it. It's really crazy. I mean, manufacturing consent basically means you have two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans in the U.S., and they are both war parties. Like they are both for bombing Libya, Iraq, Iran. Like not one party is saying, "Oh, we can't do that." I mean, Clinton, for instance, was a Democrat. He bombed Serbia, and Bush, he bombed Afghanistan, and he invaded Iraq. He was a Republican, and so you take one party or the other. It's all manufacturing consent. And I think this system has worked for many, many years, manufacturing consent. But now I think the narrative has become, narrative control has become more and more problematic or difficult, also thanks to YouTube channels like yours. Or big YouTube channels like that of Tucker Carlson, where they just break the narrative of mainstream television channels like CNN and Fox News. They break the narrative because the Russian invasion of Ukraine of 24 February 2022 in the German-speaking world is always labeled as an illegal, unprovoked war of aggression. Ein illegaler Angriffskrieg, unprovozierter illegaler Angriffskrieg. And that has been in the German media now for 3 years. And I always say, yeah, it's illegal because it's a violation of UN United Nations Charter. Like the Russians are not allowed to invade Ukraine. Ukraine is not allowed to invade Russia. And but it's not unprovoked because we had the coup d'etat in 2014, or in 2008 we had Bush inviting Ukraine to become, and Georgia, a NATO member, and before that NATO enlargement, as have explained in many cases, and also your work. But now, on Friday the 13th, Friday, June 13, 2025, we have seen Israel bombing Iran. Now,
Yeah.
that clearly is an illegal, unprovoked war of aggression. But the German media have not followed it so closely. It's in Norway or in US, but in the German-speaking world, here the phrase illegal war of aggression is not used. So people, not everybody, obviously, but people who are a bit aware of what the word narrative or what the word wording means, framing, wording, narrative, these are the three words, they start to realize that, okay, if the Russians invade, it's bad. If the Israeli bomb another country, then it's good. But the UN charters say both are forbidden. So I think narrative control is becoming harder and harder. And I see more people waking up to the fact that the West is not giving us the full story.
So, yeah, no, the, yeah, after the attack on Iran, the main talking points was, well, from political leaders. I saw the same with von der Leyen and Kaja
Oh yeah.
Kallas. They were saying, well, Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, as if it's as if this is the framing of the conflict, or
Yeah.
Israel has a right to defend itself. I mean, it's very strange. You can't claim the right to defend yourself when you're launching a surprise attack, and also you can't base a war on yeah, them not being allowed to have a nuclear weapon when our own intelligence services say that they're not trying to get a nuclear weapon. But again,
Mm.
that's what narratives are. They're storylines, and the storylines usually organize around, the virtuous us versus the criminal other. And as long as people buy into the narrative, they will usually, yeah, well, you will see that facts often have less significance. Anyways, Daniel Ganser, thank you so much for your time. And again, you have written more books, which I will put in the description. And I hope you can come back one day to discuss some of your other books as well.
Thank you very much, Glenn, for the invitation and best wishes from Switzerland to Norway.